Sandra Bullock noticed something strange the moment they stepped onto the red carpet that evening. Keanu Reeves, who always moved with calm confidence, seemed distracted in a way she had never seen before. He stayed close for the cameras, he smiled for the fans, he nodded politely at every greeting, but his eyes shifted again and again toward the far end of the venue, almost as if he heard a voice that only he could understand. She watched him carefully because she knew Keanu never acted without reason, and tonight there was a subtle tension in him that made her uneasy. He brushed it off whenever she asked if everything was all right, saying he was fine, saying it was nothing, but she knew him well enough to sense when something deeper was happening. Still, she respected his space and let the moment pass, hoping he would open up once the noise around them softened. The crowd around them kept growing louder and brighter, yet Keanu kept pulling back inch by inch, until he stood quietly behind a large display board. Sandra thought he was simply taking a breath, something he often did when the flashing lights became overwhelming. But this time it was different. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw was tight, and his hands were still in a way that contradicted his usual calm movements. Then, without warning, Keanu stepped away from the carpet, slipped past two stage crew members, and disappeared into the hallway behind the event banners. It happened so fast that Sandra almost doubted her own eyes. One blink and he was gone. For a few seconds she stood frozen, unsure whether to follow or wait, but the sudden emptiness beside her made her heart tighten. Keanu did not vanish from events. He did not walk off without explanation. Something was wrong, and she felt it deep in her chest. She excused herself from a group of interviewers and smoothly drifted away from the cameras, pretending she was heading toward the backstage lounge. Instead, she moved into the same narrow hallway where Keanu had disappeared, hoping no one would notice her slip out. The hallway lights were warm yet dim, bathing the long passage in a soft golden glow that made every shadow stretch like a quiet warning. The sound of the crowd behind her slowly faded until all she could hear was the gentle hum of the overhead lights and her own breath. She walked slowly, listening carefully, her heart steady but alert. She called his name once, very softly, as if the silence might break if she spoke too loudly. But there was no answer. She kept walking, turning corners, checking side doors, expecting him to appear at any moment with that familiar, gentle smile, ready to explain everything. But he did not. The hallway grew longer than she remembered, and she began to wonder how far he had gone. Suddenly, she heard something faint behind the next corner, a low sound, almost like a breath catching or someone whispering quietly. She held her breath and stepped forward, hoping it was him. When she turned the corner, she saw Keanu standing alone near a storage doorway, half hidden by the shadows. His back was slightly hunched, his arms folded tightly across his chest, and his fingers pressed into his sleeves as if grounding himself. He looked like a man who had been holding something inside for far too long. For a moment, Sandra felt the urge to rush to him, but something in the air around him told her to move slowly. She whispered his name again, and this time he reacted. He turned around quickly, not startled, but as if he had been waiting for someone to find him. His eyes were soft yet heavy, carrying a mix of sadness and determination that instantly made Sandra's throat tighten. She stepped closer, trying to understand what she was seeing. The Keanu she knew always protected others from his own burdens, always hid his pain behind gentle humor or quiet strength. But right now, he was not hiding anything. He looked vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. Before she could ask anything, Keanu shook his head gently, almost apologetically, as if he already knew the questions waiting on her lips. He tried to smile but could not maintain it. He looked down at the floor, exhaled deeply, and rested one hand on the wall to steady himself. Sandra felt her pulse quicken. Something serious was happening, something important enough for him to walk away from a premiere filled with people expecting him. She reached out slowly and touched his arm, not to demand answers, but to let him know she was there. When he finally looked up, there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made her heart drop. He said her name in a voice that sounded tired yet steady, as if he was preparing himself to reveal something he had kept hidden for far too long. But before he could finish his first sentence, a distant shout echoed from the far end of the hallway. It was one of the event staff, calling out someone's name urgently. Sandra did not catch the full words, but Keanu's reaction was immediate. He straightened instantly, his expression shifting from vulnerable to alert, as if the sound triggered something inside him. She watched him turn toward the direction of the voice, his posture changing in a way that made the air around them feel suddenly charged. Sandra realized she had stepped into something bigger than she expected, something that reached far beyond a moment of exhaustion or stress. The look in his eyes held a story she had not heard yet, a truth she did not know, and an urgency she did not fully understand. And before she could say anything more, Keanu took a slow breath and whispered something that made Sandra's heart stop for a beat. He said, "I didn't expect this to happen tonight." And then he stepped toward the dark end of the hallway. Sandra followed Keanu without hesitation, even though every step deeper into the hallway felt heavier than the last. She had no idea what he meant by saying he did not expect this to happen tonight, and the way he spoke those words made her chest tighten with worry. She had seen him tired before, she had seen him overwhelmed, but she had never seen that strange mix of fear and determination in his eyes. It made her feel like she had walked into a chapter of his life she had never been allowed to see until now. The hallway grew darker as they moved away from the event lights behind them, and the muffled noise of the red carpet faded until it sounded like a distant memory. The silence around them felt almost too still, as if the whole building had paused for something neither of them could name yet. Keanu walked ahead quietly, his steps slow but certain, like he was following a trail only he understood. Sandra stayed close behind him, watching the tension in his shoulders and the way he occasionally breathed in sharply, as if preparing himself for something he could not avoid. She wanted to say something, anything that would bring clarity, but every time she opened her mouth, the seriousness in his posture stopped her. He looked like a man carrying a truth that weighed more than words could hold. She could feel that whatever he was walking toward, it was something he had tried to ignore for a long time. They reached a corner where the hallway split in two directions. Keanu paused there, resting one hand lightly against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment as if gathering strength. Sandra watched him carefully, feeling her anxiety grow. She stepped closer and called his name gently, hoping he would finally share what was going on. He turned his head slightly, just enough to show he heard her, but he still did not speak. Instead, he opened his eyes slowly and looked down the left side of the hallway, where a faint flickering light glowed from an old ceiling lamp. It was the only light in that direction, and it made the long stretch of hallway look more unsettling than mysterious. Keanu whispered, "It's coming from there." Sandra frowned, confused. "What is coming from there?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated again, and for the first time since he disappeared from the red carpet, he looked directly at her with an expression that carried both fear and responsibility. He swallowed slowly and lowered his voice even more, as if afraid the walls might hear him. "Someone left something for me," he said. "I thought it was gone, but it's here." Sandra felt a chill move up her spine. The way he said it made it sound less like a message and more like a warning. She took a small step closer to him, wanting to understand. "Keanu, what kind of something?" He did not answer immediately. He glanced down the hallway again, as if expecting a shadow to appear. Then he breathed in deeply, trying to steady himself. "Something connected to my past," he said softly. "Something I didn't think would follow me anymore." Before Sandra could reply, a sudden sound echoed from the far end of the hallway. It was faint but sharp, like metal scraping lightly against the floor. Sandra froze instantly, her heartbeat quickening. Keanu's posture shifted again, this time with instant alertness. He stepped forward protectively, positioning himself slightly in front of her without thinking. It was a natural instinct of his, something she had seen many times in smaller moments, but now it carried a different weight. He was protecting her from something she could not see yet. They both stayed still for a few seconds, listening carefully. The scraping sound repeated once, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was thick and tense. Sandra felt her throat tighten. She wanted to believe it was just a staff member moving equipment, but the atmosphere said otherwise. Keanu slowly exhaled through his nose and began walking again, moving toward the sound with quiet determination. Sandra followed him, her worry deepening with every step. As they moved closer, the hallway opened into a wider space that looked like an old maintenance area. The walls were slightly scuffed, and there were several stacked crates near the corners, the kind used for transporting event equipment. The flickering light above them cast uneven shadows across the floor, making everything look distorted and uncertain. And there, near the center of the open area, lay a small envelope on the ground. The envelope was old, its edges slightly torn, and there was no name written on it. But Keanu stopped the moment he saw it, his body going completely still. Sandra looked at him closely, noticing the shift in his breathing, the tension in his hands, the way his eyes locked on the envelope with quiet disbelief. She touched his arm carefully, feeling the coldness under his skin. "Keanu, what is that?" she whispered. He lowered his head slightly and closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "I got one just like this years ago," he said quietly, "and I hoped I would never see another." Sandra felt her stomach twist. His voice carried a kind of exhausted pain that made her realize this moment had roots she did not know about. She stepped closer to the envelope, but Keanu gently held out his hand to stop her. "Wait," he said softly. "Let me check it first." He slowly crouched down and picked up the envelope with careful hands. He examined the edges, almost as if he expected it to reveal a hidden danger. Then he slowly opened it. Sandra watched the way his shoulders tightened the moment his eyes fell on whatever was inside. He removed a small folded paper and stared at it without speaking. His reaction was subtle but powerful. His lips parted slightly in shock, his breath caught in his throat, and a deep sorrow flickered across his face like a shadow passing over light. "Keanu, what does it say?" Sandra asked gently. He did not look at her. He kept staring at the paper, frozen in a moment she could not enter. For a long few seconds he seemed lost in the past, dragged into a memory that was painful enough to silence him. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward her with eyes full of something she had never seen in him before. And when he finally spoke, his voice trembled just enough for her to feel the weight of the words before he even said them. "It says you were not supposed to be here," Sandra's breath caught. But before she could speak, the lights above them flickered hard once, twice, and then went completely dark. The darkness fell so suddenly that Sandra could not even see her own hand when she lifted it. The hallway felt swallowed by a silence so dense it pressed against her ears. For a moment she thought maybe the entire building had lost power, but deep inside she knew that what was happening was not just an accident. There was an intention behind the timing, behind the flickering lights, behind the message in the envelope. Her heart raced as she reached out blindly, trying to find Keanu in the thick shadows. She whispered his name, but the sound felt too soft in the heavy stillness. She took another small step forward, hands trembling slightly, her breath sharp in her throat. Then she felt it, Keanu's hand closing around hers with a steady grip. She nearly gasped out of relief. Even in the darkness, she could sense the tension in him, a quiet readiness, as if every nerve in his body had gone alert. His voice came low and controlled, barely above a whisper. "Stay close to me," he said, his tone gentle but firm. She nodded instinctively even though he could not see her. She tightened her hold, grounding herself with the warmth of his touch. His presence had always carried a calm strength, but tonight it felt like a shield she desperately needed. The lights flickered faintly for a second, giving them a small glimpse of the maintenance area. The crates, the old pillars, the scattered boxes. And then the darkness swallowed everything again. Sandra felt Keanu shift, stepping slightly in front of her. She knew he was listening for any sound, any clue, any movement. She heard her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and unsteady. Then, somewhere in the blackness, something creaked. It was a slow, dragging sound, like a door opening or something heavy shifting across the floor. Sandra held her breath. Keanu's grip on her hand tightened just enough to reassure her he was still in control. He leaned closer to her and whispered, "There's someone here." Her blood ran cold. She wanted to ask who, but the fear of making noise kept her silent. Keanu slowly let go of her hand, and she felt a sudden emptiness rush over her, but then she sensed him moving beside her, stepping quietly, almost soundless. He was trying to create space, trying to position himself between her and anything approaching. Sandra touched the wall with her fingers, her body tingling with adrenaline. She did not want to be alone in the dark, yet she trusted Keanu enough to know he had a plan even if she could not see it. Another sound echoed through the hall, this one sharper, almost like metal tapping against the floor. Then came the faintest breath, not hers and not Keanu's. It came from somewhere in front of them. Sandra felt her stomach twist. Someone was standing in the darkness, someone was watching them. Suddenly, a light, small and dim, appeared near the far end of the hall. It flickered weakly, revealing nothing more than a blurred silhouette. The figure stood perfectly still, and the dim light cast a long shadow behind it. Sandra froze as the outline slowly shifted, turning slightly toward them. Keanu stepped forward without hesitation. He did not rush, he did not show fear, but there was a quiet authority in his movements, the kind of presence that demanded attention without raising a voice. "What do you want?" Keanu asked, his tone low, calm, and steady in a way that only someone who had lived through storms could speak. The silhouette did not respond. It remained motionless, as if deciding whether to step forward or retreat. The small light flickered again, and for a second, Sandra thought she saw the faint shape of an arm, but she could not be sure. She tried to study the figure, but the shadows kept it hidden. Then the figure raised its hand slowly, revealing something small between its fingers. The gesture was not threatening, but it was strange enough to send a nervous shiver up her spine. Keanu's posture tensed, and he spoke again, more firmly this time. "Say something." Finally, the silhouette moved. The small, dim light shifted enough to reveal the outline of a hooded jacket and a lowered head. Then, in a soft voice barely louder than a whisper, the figure spoke. "You weren't supposed to see the message yet." Sandra's breath caught. The voice did not sound threatening. It sounded tired, almost fragile. But the words themselves made her heart jump. Keanu took another step forward, shielding Sandra with his body. "Why did you follow me?" he asked quietly. The figure lifted its head slightly but remained hidden in the dim light. "I didn't follow you," the voice replied. "I wanted to warn you." Keanu narrowed his eyes, trying to see more clearly. "Warn me about what?" The figure hesitated, shifting weight slightly, as if struggling with something heavy inside. Then it whispered, "There are more messages." Sandra felt the chill move across her skin. Keanu took a slow breath. "Who sent them?" The figure shook its head weakly. "I don't know," it said. "But they've been watching you." Keanu's jaw tightened. "Who?" he repeated, his voice sharper now. The figure stepped back once as though frightened. "I'm not the enemy," it said softly. "I'm only trying to help." Then the small, dim light flickered out completely, dropping them back into full darkness. Sandra's heart pounded. "Keanu," she whispered, reaching out. He grabbed her hand instantly. "I'm here," he said, pulling her closer. The hallway felt colder now, the air heavier. Then suddenly footsteps, fast, light, and retreating, echoed down the corridor. The figure was running. Keanu reacted immediately, guiding Sandra to the side and pressing her gently against the wall to keep her safe. "Stay here," he whispered. But before she could respond, he slipped away into the darkness. "Keanu, wait," she whispered, reaching out. But he was already moving toward the sound, chasing the fading footsteps that echoed like a warning through the unseen hallway. And in the silence that followed, Sandra felt something unexpected, something soft, something cold, something paper-like lying on the floor near her shoe. She crouched slowly, trembling, and picked it up. Another envelope. This one had her name on it. Sandra stared at the envelope in her hands, unable to move for several seconds. Her name written across the front felt unreal, almost impossible, as if the hallway itself had whispered her identity into the paper. She touched the letters with trembling fingers, feeling the uneven ink, the slight pressure marks where someone had written quickly. Her heart sank deeper with every small detail she noticed. Whoever left this had been close enough to know she was here, close enough to place it near her while she looked into the darkness searching for Keanu. That thought alone made her knees feel weak. She turned the envelope over slowly, studying every edge. There was no seal, no design, nothing that identified who had created it. But something about its weight felt wrong, as if it carried more than just paper. Sandra swallowed hard and looked down the hallway where Keanu had disappeared. She could still hear faint echoes of the footsteps he had chased, fading more and more with each passing second. She wanted to follow him, to run after him, to stay close, but she knew if she left this envelope behind she might miss something important, something that could explain everything. Sandra took a slow breath and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper, thin and slightly worn. She unfolded it with steady hands, bracing herself for whatever message waited inside. The handwriting was the same as the one Keanu had found earlier, small, hurried, and slightly uneven, as if written by someone who didn't have much time. The message read, "You should not have followed him." Sandra felt her heart tighten painfully. She read it again, hoping she had misunderstood, but the words remained the same. Her fingers clenched the edges of the paper as fear crept into her chest. This message was about her, directly addressed to her, left only moments after the first one. Whoever was behind this was not guessing. They knew where she was. They knew she had followed Keanu. They knew she was involved now. She took a shaky breath and whispered to herself, "Why me?" She had known Keanu for years, trusted him deeply, and shared countless moments of friendship and respect with him, yet she had never imagined being pulled into something so shadowed, something that felt like a secret he had tried to bury. She sat still, listening for any sound that could signal Keanu's return. But all she heard was the faint hum of the emergency lights turning back on somewhere in the distance. Then footsteps, slow ones this time, echoed from the opposite direction of where Keanu had gone. Sandra froze, clutching the envelope in her hand. The sound was soft, almost careful, like someone trying not to startle her. She pressed herself slightly against the wall, her breath quiet and controlled, though her pulse raced. The footsteps drew closer, steady and deliberate, but then she recognized the familiar rhythm. It was him. Keanu emerged from the darkness, breathing heavily but controlled, his hair slightly disheveled from running. When he saw her still there, standing alone with the envelope in her hand, his expression changed instantly. Worry, frustration, and protective instinct collided in his eyes all at once. He walked straight to her, placing one hand gently on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, searching her face. She nodded but held up the envelope. "Keanu, this was left for me." His eyes widened slightly. He took the paper carefully from her hands and read it. The moment he finished, his jaw tightened in a way she rarely saw. He folded the note slowly, as if trying to control the emotions running through him. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just stood there, breathing deeply, staring down at the paper like it was a piece of a puzzle he never wanted to face again. Finally, he looked up at her, his voice soft but heavy. "I'm sorry you're involved in this." She frowned, stepping closer. "Keanu, don't apologize. I followed you because I was worried, and I'm still worried. Talk to me. Tell me what this is." He hesitated again, the same way he did in part 2, as if the truth itself was a chain wrapped around his chest. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, thinking, struggling. "This isn't about tonight," he whispered. "It's something that started years ago, something I thought had ended." Sandra felt the pull in her stomach again. "You said someone left the first message years ago. What happened back then?" Keanu stared at the ground for several seconds, his breath slow and uneven. "I received messages like these when I worked on a project overseas. Anonymous ones. Always telling me where I shouldn't be, where not to go, hinting at danger but never explaining anything clearly. I didn't know who sent them, but they always came right before something went wrong. Equipment failures, schedule changes, unexpected setbacks. Small things, but strange enough to notice." Sandra listened closely, her worry deepening. He continued, "And then one day they stopped, completely. No messages, no signs, nothing for years. I thought whoever was behind it had moved on, or that it had all been resolved without me knowing." Sandra watched him carefully. "And now they're back." Keanu nodded slowly. "And they aren't warning me this time, they're watching." A cold shiver ran through her. She held her arms close to her chest, feeling the weight of everything he had just said. But before she could respond, a sudden sound crackled above them, like an old speaker turning on. Sandra and Keanu both looked up. One of the emergency lights flickered again, and then a faint murmur echoed from the small ceiling speaker, distorted and unclear. Keanu stepped protectively in front of Sandra as the voice struggled through static. "You should have stayed apart." The message was faint, but the words were unmistakable. Sandra grabbed Keanu's arm tightly. The voice came again, slightly clearer. "Now you both need to listen." Keanu's entire body went still. Sandra whispered, her voice shaking, "Keanu, what is happening?" The speaker crackled one last time before the voice faded, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier than before. Then a new sound echoed from down the hallway, the slow creak of a door opening. Keanu turned his head sharply, his expression tightening with focus. Sandra felt her pulse drop into her stomach as they both stared into the dim corridor where the sound had come from, waiting for whoever, or whatever, had just stepped into their night. The creak of the distant door seemed to echo forever, fading slowly into the dim hallway like a quiet warning neither of them could ignore. Sandra felt her breath lock in her chest as she stood frozen beside Keanu, watching his posture shift into something sharper, something focused, something almost protective by instinct. He moved one step ahead of her, his shoulders slightly angled as if shielding her from a threat he could not yet see. The air in the hallway changed, growing denser and colder, as if the entire building was holding its breath with them. For several long seconds, nothing happened. No footsteps, no voice, no movement. The hallway remained still in that heavy, unnatural silence. Sandra felt her pulse throbbing in her ears, loud enough that she worried the sound alone might draw attention. She gripped her own arms tightly, trying to steady herself. She wanted to tell Keanu she wasn't afraid, but the truth was she had never felt anything like this. She had walked through scripts filled with drama, acted in scenes designed to raise tension, but this quiet uncertainty surrounding them, felt painfully real. Keanu finally spoke, his voice low but perfectly steady. "Stay behind me," he whispered. His words carried no panic, no fear, only a calm sense of duty, as if he had stepped into a role he never wanted but instinctively understood. Sandra nodded even though he could not see her well in the dim light. They both listened again, waiting for any sign of movement from the darkened hall. The door that had creaked open remained hidden beyond a stretch of shadows, far enough that they had no clear view, but close enough that they knew someone had to be there. Sandra leaned slightly toward Keanu, her fingers brushing his arm, grounding herself in his presence. He glanced back at her for a brief second, a silent reassurance passing between them, a small spark of strength exchanged in the quiet. Then a faint sound came through the dark, not footsteps this time. Breathing. Soft, uneven breathing like someone trying to stay quiet but failing. Sandra tensed immediately. Keanu took a slow breath and stepped forward again, his movements measured and silent. He walked toward the shadowed corner where the breathing seemed to come from, his senses sharp, his body shifting with controlled caution. As he approached the darker stretch of the hallway, the faint emergency light behind them flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows across the floor. Sandra stayed several steps behind, her heart tight with fear yet unwilling to leave him alone. She trusted him deeply, but the idea of him confronting something unknown in the shadows made her chest ache. Suddenly, a soft whisper rose from the darkness. "Stop!" Keanu froze instantly. Sandra did too. The voice was not the same as the one from the speaker earlier. This one sounded young, trembling, and strained, as if fighting both fear and exhaustion. Keanu narrowed his eyes, trying to make out the shape hidden near the open doorway. The silhouette slowly stepped forward into the faint light. It was the same figure from before, the hooded one who had spoken in the dark, the one who had warned Keanu there were more messages. The dim emergency light revealed just enough for Sandra to see a glimpse of the person's face. It was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, with tired eyes and a pale expression, as if he had been carrying a burden far too heavy for far too long. Keanu took a careful step forward. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The young man raised his trembling hand, signaling him to stop. "Please don't come closer," he whispered. His voice cracked slightly, like someone holding back panic or guilt. He looked at Sandra then, his gaze dropping to the envelope in her hand. "You weren't supposed to read that," he murmured. Sandra felt a chill move across her skin. "Why did you write it?" she asked softly. The young man shook his head quickly. "I didn't write it," he replied. "I only delivered it." Keanu's voice hardened. "Delivered for who?" The young man lowered his eyes, his fingers twisting nervously. "I don't know," he said. "I never saw their face. I only know the instructions they gave me." Sandra exchanged a tense glance with Keanu. "Why us?" she asked. The young man swallowed hard. "Because," he hesitated, struggling for words, "because something is going to happen tonight, something they didn't want you to see." Keanu's jaw tightened. "What's going to happen?" The young man stepped back slightly, fear washing over his expression. "I don't know everything. They never told me details. They only said you needed to be kept away from the main stage, both of you." Sandra's heart dropped. "Why? What does the main stage have to do with this?" The young man looked down, breathing shakily. "There's someone waiting there. Someone who doesn't want either of you near them." Keanu took a slow step forward, ignoring the young man's plea to stay back. "Who?" he asked, his tone steady but intense. "Tell me who is behind this." The young man's voice trembled. "I can't. They warned me too. They said if I spoke their name, everything would get worse." Keanu shook his head firmly. "Worse for who?" The young man's eyes glistened, almost as if he were on the edge of breaking. "For you," he whispered. "And for her?" Sandra felt something tighten inside her chest. There was a sincerity in the young man's trembling voice that made her believe he was caught in something far beyond his control. She stepped closer to Keanu, her voice soft but steady. "We need to know what's going on. Please, you have to tell us something." The young man looked at her with eyes full of guilt and urgency. "I tried to warn you," he said. "The messages, the speaker, everything was meant to push you away from the main event." He paused, lowering his voice even more. "Because the person waiting there doesn't want this night to go how you expect. They have a plan. And they don't want you involved." Keanu clenched his fists. "Why?" the young man whispered, barely audible. "Because they think you'll stop them." A wave of cold fear washed through Sandra. Keanu stepped forward again, his voice low but unshakably steady. "Where is this person now?" The young man swallowed hard, opening his mouth to answer. But before he could speak, a loud crash erupted from somewhere behind them. The sound echoed through the hallway like a violent warning, and Sandra jumped in shock, her breath catching instantly. Keanu instinctively grabbed her arm and pulled her close, his eyes locking onto the young man for answers. The young man backed away toward the shadows again, panic rising across his face. "They're here," he whispered. Keanu's heart slammed against his chest. Sandra felt her knees weaken, and somewhere in the dark, footsteps began approaching. The footsteps echoed closer, steady and unhurried, as if the person approaching was not afraid of being heard. The sound filled the hallway like a slow drumbeat, each step carrying a quiet confidence that twisted Sandra's stomach with dread. Keanu straightened immediately, his attention sharp, his instincts heightening into something protective and unbreakable. He stepped in front of Sandra without hesitation, his presence shielding her from whoever, or whatever, was coming. Sandra clutched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles, sensing that he was preparing himself for something he had feared would arrive for years. The young man who had warned them backed further into the shadows, whispering shakily, "I shouldn't have stayed. They told me not to watch." Fear pulled at his voice, but he did not run. Instead, he pressed himself against the wall as though trying to disappear from the moment entirely. Sandra looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of someone who had clearly been used, someone who had been carrying messages without truly understanding the danger behind them. The footsteps slowed, then stopped just before entering the dim glow of the emergency light. For a breathless moment, everything fell still. Keanu kept his body angled protectively, waiting for the figure to reveal themselves. Sandra stayed behind him, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes unblinking, refusing to turn away. She was not going to abandon him now, not after everything that had happened tonight. Slowly, the figure stepped into the faint light. It was not someone violent or threatening, not someone wearing dark clothes or a mask. Instead, it was a woman, older, thin, and standing with a fragile stiffness in her posture. Her eyes were soft but exhausted, filled with a deep sorrow that seemed to weigh down her entire frame. Her presence was not aggressive. It was broken. Her hands shook gently at her sides, and her expression carried something between regret and longing. Keanu's eyes widened in recognition, and Sandra felt him tense in a completely different way than before. The woman whispered, "Keanu, it's me." The sound of her voice made him close his eyes briefly, as if struck by a memory he had buried long ago. When he opened them again, Sandra saw a raw mixture of pain and compassion inside him. She had never seen his face change so fast, shifting between understanding, confusion, and quiet sorrow. Keanu stepped forward slowly. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly. The woman looked down, her breathing uneven. "To tell you the truth I didn't have the courage to say before." Sandra watched silently, her heart tightening. She realized she was witnessing a moment rooted in years of unresolved pain, something Keanu had carried in silence, something he had never spoken about. The woman took another soft breath. "I sent the first messages years ago," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not to frighten you, never for that. I only wanted to keep you safe." Keanu inhaled sharply. "Safe from what?" The woman's eyes glistened. "From me," she said softly. "From my mistakes, from the consequences I created." She looked at Sandra, her eyes full of apology. "I never wanted her involved," she said softly. "But when she followed you, I panicked. I didn't know what else to do." Keanu stepped closer, his voice steady but full of hurt. "You dragged her into something she had nothing to do with." "I know," the woman whispered, "and I'm sorry. More than I can say." The young man stepped forward slightly, his voice quiet. "She didn't threaten me. She didn't force me. She only asked for help. I delivered the messages because she was too afraid to do it herself." Sandra looked between all three of them, trying to piece together the tangled story. "But why now?" she asked. "Why tonight?" The woman lowered her gaze. "Because tonight I learned something," she said gently. "Something important about you, Keanu, something I should have understood years ago." She wiped her trembling hands on her sleeves. "I spent too many years living with guilt. Guilt for decisions I made. Guilt for not protecting someone I cared about. Guilt for stepping away when I should have stayed close. And I convinced myself that if I could at least keep you safe, even from a distance, maybe it would balance the mistakes I made." Keanu softened slightly but kept his voice calm. "You could have just talked to me." She let out a shaky breath. "I didn't think I deserved the chance." Keanu looked at her quietly, and the silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken history. Sandra felt her chest tighten, sensing the depth of their connection, the pain woven between them. This was not a threat. This was someone broken by regret, someone who had made wrong choices for reasons she believed were right at the time. The woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight I came to the premiere because I wanted to see if you were okay, but then I saw you with her." She looked at Sandra with soft eyes. "The way she followed you when you walked away, the way she didn't hesitate, the way she cared." She paused, emotion catching her voice. "I realized you weren't alone anymore." Sandra's throat tightened, her breath catching. Keanu turned to look at her, and she saw something new in his eyes, gratitude. The woman smiled faintly through her tears. So I came to say one last thing, and then I'll disappear from your life just like I promised myself. Keanu stepped closer gently. You don't have to disappear. She shook her head, her voice soft. Yes, I do. Not because I want to leave, but because you deserve peace, and I can't be the reason you lose it again. She handed him a folded photograph. Keanu took it slowly. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it. Sandra leaned in. The photo was old, worn, showing Keanu much younger alongside the woman and another person whose face was crossed out with time's damage, someone important, someone gone. The woman whispered, I couldn't save him, but I tried to save you. Keanu closed his eyes, breathing deeply to steady himself. When he opened them, his voice was gentle. Thank you, he whispered, for trying. The woman nodded through her quiet tears, relief softening her stiff posture. Then she turned to leave, but Keanu spoke again, his tone warm. You can stop running now. She froze. Sandra stepped beside Keanu, adding softly, no more messages, no more shadows. It's time to let go. The woman closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, the kind of breath someone releases after carrying a burden for far too long. She nodded once deeply, then walked away down the hallway, her figure shrinking into the dim light until she disappeared completely. The hallway fell silent again, but this time the silence felt lighter, as if a long-locked door inside Keanu had finally opened. He turned to Sandra slowly, his eyes soft, tired, but peaceful in a way she hadn't seen all night. She stepped closer, searching his face. Are you okay? He breathed deeply and nodded. I will be. She reached out and held his hand. You don't have to face things alone anymore. Keanu looked at their hands, then into her eyes. I know, he whispered, and I'm grateful you followed me. They stood together in the warm silence, the tension fading like a passing storm. The emergency lights brightened, the hallway slowly returning to normal, the shadows shrinking back into harmless corners. Finally, Keanu lifted her hand gently. Let's go back, he said softly. We still have a premiere waiting. Sandra smiled, relief filling her chest. And this time we go together. They walked side by side out of the dim hallway and back toward the light, toward the crowd, the cameras, the world that had no idea what kind of night they had just survived. But now they moved with a deeper understanding. Keanu was no longer carrying the weight alone, and Sandra, after following him into the shadows, had become the one who helped him step back into the light.